President Obama now has a Supreme Court vacancy to deal with. It's almost impossible to believe looking back on it, but your first justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who will be likely the most liberal member of the court once Stevens resigns, she was confirmed 96-3. Senator Orrin Hatch, who is the leading Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee, has credited you with really bringing him into the consultation process. What advice would you give President Obama? Because Republicans are saying he's not including them in this.
Well, I think, for one thing, I had to do a little more of that because I never had a filibuster-proof Senate. And now there are 41 of them, although I think that a lot of those who come from more progressive states, the two main senators, the new senator from Massachusetts, a lot of them may think they already gave it the store on the health care deal or whatever they're doing on financial reform. I think it'll be very difficult to just outright block a Supreme Court nominee that's otherwise qualified, especially after the Democrats confirmed or allowed a vote on Clarence Thomas and Justice Scalia and a lot of other people who were Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts. My advice to him would be to, first of all, see what the court's missing. Does it matter that if he puts a Catholic or a Jewish person or someone of another faith on the court, there would be no Protestants on the Supreme Court? Does that matter? Does there need to be another woman on the court? Should there be some other group represented? Because Justice Stevens was part of the four-person progressive bloc, he will, of course, nominate someone who will be part of that. We've seen the hard way in the Citizens United case on campaign finance and in Bush v. Gore, which is one of the most bizarre rulings in the history of the Supreme Court, and I think one of the 5 worst, what the consequences of that are. But I would also I don't expect him to intentionally pick a fight with the Senate, but he can't avoid it if he finds somebody that he thinks is just the best person. But the most important thing is he needs to be really proud of the people he puts on the court. The 2 people I put on the court have made me proud. I haven't agreed with every decision they've made. That's not the important thing. The important thing is that you think they're smart and they're competent and they understand the lives of ordinary people. Now, one thing I think you should think about is, have we gone too far in this process that assuming only judges can be elected, that somehow you're not qualified if you weren't a judge? Some of the best justices of the Supreme Court in history have been non-judges. People that, as Hugo Black once famously said, had been sheriffs or county judges. People that have seen how the lofty decisions of the Supreme Court affect the ordinary lives of Americans. I tried to persuade both Senator Mitchell and Governor Cuomo to accept appointments to the court, and for different reasons, neither one wanted to do it. I think they would have been fabulous justices. And now George Mitchell had been a judge, but he was also a senator. I think that, I hope he'll take a look at somebody who hasn't been a judge.
William Howard Taft, 8 years after his presidency, went to the Supreme Court. I've heard some Democrats say, why isn't Bill Clinton on any of these short lists? Would you enjoy doing that?
That would be, I think I would enjoy it, but I don't think it would be a good idea.
Why?
Because I'm already 63 years old. I hope I live to be 90. I hope I'm just as healthy as Justice Stevens is. But it's not predictable. I'd like to see him put someone in their late 40s or early 50s on the court, and someone with a lot of energy for the job. And I don't think that'd be a good choice. I love what I'm doing now, and what I'm doing now is something that I'm uniquely qualified to do, whereas there are many people who could be good on the court.
Senator Hatch raised the subject of a different Justice Clinton, your wife. Do you think she'd be good at that?
Oh, she would be great at it. But, and I think at one point in her life she might have been interested in it. But she's like me, we're kind of doers. We like being out there doing things, rowing our own boat, and making changes we can see happen. And again, I think if she were asked, she would advise the president to appoint someone 10, 15 years younger.
You mentioned financial regulatory reform. One of the things that President Obama is pushing for is regulation of derivatives, and also with a thing called the Volcker Rule, he's trying to separate commercial banking interests from investment banking interests. These were things that were the opposite policies of Treasury Secretary Rubin and Summers at the time. Do you think, in retrospect, they gave you bad advice on those issues?
Well, I think on the derivatives, before the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed, it had been breached. There was already a total merger, practically, of commercial and investment banking. And really the main thing that the Glass-Steagall Act did was to give us some power to regulate it, when the repeal, and also to give old-fashioned traditional banks in all over America the right to take an investment interest if they wanted to forestall bankruptcy. Sadly, none of them did that. Mostly it was just the continued blurring of the lines. But only about a third of all the money loaned today is loaned through traditional banking channels, and that was well underway before that legislation was signed. So I don't feel the same way about that. I think what happened was the SEC and the whole regulatory apparatus after I left office was just let go. I think if Arthur Levitt had been on the job at the SEC, my last SEC commissioner, an enormous percentage of what we've been through in the last 8 or 9 years would not have happened. I feel very strongly about it. I think it's important to have vigorous oversight. Now, on derivatives, yeah, I think they were wrong, and I think I was wrong to take it. Because the argument on derivatives was that these things are expensive and sophisticated, and only a handful of investors will buy them. And they don't need any extra protection and any extra transparency. The money they're putting up guarantees them transparency. And the flaw in that argument was that, first of all, sometimes people with a lot of money make stupid decisions and make it without transparency. And secondly, the most important flaw was, even if less than 1% of the total investment community is involved in derivatives exchanges, so much money was involved that if they went bad, they could affect 100% of the investments, and indeed 100% of the citizens in countries, not investors. And I was wrong about that. I've said that all along. Now, I think if I had tried to regulate them, because the Republicans were in a majority in the Congress, they would have stopped it. But I wish I should have been caught trying. That was a mistake I made.
You've come closer than any president in recent history in brokering a Mideast peace plan. President Obama's in a situation right now where he's getting a lot of conflicting advice. Do you think it's time for President Obama to put a peace plan on the table?
Well, first of all, I'm reluctant to give him public advice. I talk to the President and the Secretary of State and Mr. Emanuel and others privately. But let me answer you this way, because I don't want to do anything to foreclose their options. The argument against doing that is that the current Israeli government, with its current coalition, almost certainly would reject it. And the argument is that that makes us look weak. I think they may decide it's more important to have clarity and to do something that will be an action-forcing event to put them back to the table. And if he decides to do it, I will support it. And I think if he decides to do it, he should acknowledge that they may come up with a deal that's slightly different than the one he proposes, but we need to do something to deprive both sides of any excuse not to engage in serious negotiations. Look at the ramifications of this. Half of the energy coming out of all this organization and money raising for terror comes out of the allegations around the unresolved Palestinian issue. If there were a Palestinian state working in partnership with the policies Mr. Fayyad's following on the West Bank, it would be a whole different world. All the Arabs would identify with Israel. They'd have a political and economic partnership. The whole economic basis of the Middle East would shift from oil to ideas. Look at what the Saudi Arabians are doing, building 6 new towns. The UAE wins the international competition for the Clean Energy Agency, and they're going to build a carbon neutral city in the UAE, and nobody thinks about this. Dubai is the only country with huge amounts of imported workers that's actually passed legislation to give these immigrant workers a better deal in the Middle East, and they have women in the government, they have a joint public-private decision-making process. Nobody knows anything about it. Why? Because of the Palestinian-Israeli thing. How could the Syrians stay out there alone, cooperating with the Iranians and letting Hezbollah people travel through Syria and doing all the things they do? If there were a peace for the Palestinians, they would have to come along with the rest of the Arab states. There would be a peace between Israel and Syria. This is a huge deal. So the fact that the president's putting new energy into this, taking personal responsibility for it, and trying to get them back to the table, that's the most important thing. If this is the tactic he decides to adopt, I will strongly support it.
When you were watching healthcare reform finally pass, after having tried it yourself, did you see it as something like, I'm glad we stormed the castle in 93, 94 because that paved the way for this?
Absolutely. You know, before I did it, President Nixon had tried, President Truman had tried, President Johnson had the biggest congressional majority, didn't even try for universal health care. He did two important things, Medicare and Medicaid. He thought even with that Congress, he couldn't get it. We were the first administration that ever got a bill out of committee. We got 2 or 3 bills out of committee. And once I saw William Kristol's memo to Bob Dole, I realized we never had a chance because we couldn't pass it without 5 or 6 Republicans. I had an obstacle President Obama didn't have. They had an absolute clear filibuster number. That is, they had 45 Republican senators, they could have lost 4 and still defeated me. I felt like Teddy Roosevelt would have felt if he'd still been alive in the 1930s, seeing his cousin Franklin being able to sign legislation in areas that he had advocated. And you know, that took 2 decades and this took less time. So I was thrilled by it and worked hard. Hillary and I lobbied people all over the weekend before the vote, and she and I were ecstatic. It's sometimes takes a long time to change a country, and I think, frankly, now they'll keep changing this bill. They'll have to keep working on it and putting more cost drivers in it to take the cost down, but it's a big, big step, and it's a wonderful thing for the country.
President Clinton, thanks so much for joining us. Congratulations on the 3rd anniversary of CGIU.
Thank you.